Hi, welcome everybody to the second part of week 3 of the programs for rewriting skyscraper history. I'm delighted to be able to report that our idea of a flipped lecture is working very well because already 76 people have seen Kate's talk, probably even more in the 45 minutes before this session just started. And we are assuming now that people who have done their homework have excellent questions. And before I forget, and I will remind myself to keep mentioning through the course of this webinar, that we're going to entertain questions in the chat box. And there have been a number of questions that have already been received through emails and other formats. So we plan to use this session as a way to continue the discussion that we started on Monday. And I hope that most of you joined us then, but if not, we're framing our issues and discussion around the topic of corporate versus commercial. For those of you who have just seen Kate's talk, the idea of a corporate entity that had essentially, and my choice of word, and I hope we'll discuss this, a kind of factory of production that happened to be in a tall building in a skyscraper, kind of raised a question for me that I thought we could continue in the discussion tonight. About the corporate headquarters, where corporate imagery, in the sense that Gail talked about it in her talk on Monday with the Woolworth Building, Singer Building, Metropolitan Life, where big business entities marked their presence on the skyline and publicized themselves through their buildings. So this session, I thought we would continue that discussion, but I would also incorporate some questions that have been raised. And I asked Kate a few questions, and since the answer to those seemed to warrant a few more slides, we have kind of two sections. I'm going to show a few slides here at the beginning, both in order to reintroduce our speakers and also to raise some questions. Then we'll talk with the three of us on the screen a bit, and then I think Kate may go into a very brief kind of postscript lecture about the skyscraper headquarters of the AT&T building. Okay. Again, welcoming you to skyscraper history, looking back from the 21st century. Gail's book, and I thought I would show the covers of Gail and Kate's books. Well, at least 3 of their books, although they've written more. These are the ones germane to our session on skyscrapers. But here's the wonderful cover of the skyscraper in the city, the definitive monograph on the Woolworth building. In so many of the aspects, many more aspects than Gail was able to discuss in her 30-minute talk or so. And we're going to ask her some questions about her research approach and the places, the archives, and the various kind of resources that she went to in order to explore all these dimensions of the building. And then with Kate's book and her dissertation, which focused on Leopoldite, late 19th century New York architect, and a firm that continued to be interested and commissioned to create these infrastructure buildings that evolved into a firm, kind of corporate firm of Voorhees, Gmelin, and Walker, a series of names and a long list of names that eventually became HLW. And you can see the one episode that really celebrates the skyscraper headquarters of the New York Telephone Company in this monograph that she did on Ralph Walker. So one of the things that Gail spoke about is the idea of the popular postcard, the importance of tourism and kind of consuming these buildings as objects of desire, objects of spectacle, and then remembering them or bragging to your friends as you sent them a postcard with your greetings from New York. And this particular one, which is one of the favorites of my collection, you see, of course, the Flatiron Building and the Singer Building over on the side, and then a building that some of you might not know that well, the City Investing Company, built in the same year as the Singer Building. So this idea that Gail raised of these companies promoting themselves with the image of their buildings, as well as the experience of the buildings from on high or looking at from a distance in the illuminated night sky, to the idea of the observation deck too as a revenue producer is one of the questions that came up in the course of the reactions to Gail's talk. And of course, she has all of the answers to exactly how much money was garnered by the fees for the tickets of the Woolworth building. And she'll answer that question about her researches too. Another one of these ideas is the company projecting its primacy through the message and the image of the building, but also in the competition for height. And of course, here with the Singer Building, completed in 1908, in the monograph that presents the history of the Singer Building that was written by Semch, you see the Singer triumphing and overtopping the Egyptian pyramids, as well as the Washington Monument, that until the turn of the, well, until the skyscrapers were the tallest thing on the in the world, the tallest buildings in the world. But the competition for tallest is a perennial point of interest that we certainly experience today in every next announcement of what might be the world's tallest building. But a category that we don't develop very much interest in, it seems, is the world's largest building. And here is a construction view of the City Investing Company, which sat on the same block, now demolished as is the Singer Building, but sat on the same block as the Singer and was built in the same year. So on one block on Broadway in 1907-8, both the tallest building in the world and the largest building in the world were being constructed. The Francis Hatch Kimball City Investing is, as you can see in this slide, just a big container of space. But of course, the building that comes down to us through monographs, through postcards and fascination is really the Singer Building, which shows how much attachment there is, how much titillation and true interest there is in building the world's tallest building. But if we're contrasting the ideas of corporate and commercial, here on this same block is that perfect binary of a corporate building projecting itself through its image, even though it's not providing office space for the corporation. It's not a hive of a corporation, it's just the location of the executive offices on like a floor and a half of the building, but yet the projection on the skyline of the power of that company. But on the other hand, the City Investing Company, which is a purely speculative tower, has much more space, top of my head, half again more square feet of rentable space. There's the commercial motive being introduced as the foremost thing of importance, rather than height and fame. So it's something to think about, and we will pursue further in subsequent talks in the series. And then the same idea of the night skyline of the building standing out, and of the world's tallest building when the Singer Building was overtopped in 1909 by the Metropolitan Life Insurance. And you see how the company used the image of their building in order to message the importance of insurance, and how Metropolitan Life could in effect light the way. And another issue that was raised in Kate Holliday's talk is the issue of gender, as Gail did too, referred in other buildings in skyscraper history that have been researched by a number of different scholars. And with the Metropolitan Life, these are the Metropolitan Bells, the secretaries and clerks of the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, who recorded the contributions or the payments for insurance policies, and then their male overseers at higher desks, the supervisors sitting at higher desks. This happens to be the earlier headquarters on Madison Square than the tower, but it raises the issue that we want to talk further about, and Kate did talk certainly much more about with the female operators. The idea of the gendered workplace is a topic that's raised, especially in the buildings of this era. I'm going, let's see, I'll stop here because it raises the issue that now Kate will discuss with a few more slides about the executive headquarters of the AT&T company, the telephone company in New York, as it expanded and as it replaced the Western Union Company on the same site that you're seeing here from the Wells Bosworth headquarters from about 1912. That was made in one first piece and then expanded up until 1922. And as you see, and as Kate talked about in her lecture, the juxtaposition of the image of the tower of the millionaire Frank W. Woolworth, who did have his offices in the Woolworth Company, but nevertheless, the building was occupied by more than 1,000 tenants, and it was really a speculative office building, as Gail illuminated in her talk. And you're seeing also the top part of the AT&T building in the image that it projected through the sculpture of communications. And finally, just to look back from the 21st century, this idea of a corporate image, this of course is Philip Johnson with his design for the AT&T building headquarters just before they essentially were disbanded and gave up their headquarters, an enormously expensive building, a very indulgent building on part of the CEOs of that company, but it does raise the issue about architects branding themselves through the architecture too, that I think we might begin to discuss. I'll ask, excuse me, Kate and Gail to pose some questions themselves and maybe introduce some of the ideas that were raised, Kate, by Gail's talk on Monday, and then maybe you could segue into this other idea about corporate, the kind of anomaly of the headquarters building on Broadway, and how that contrasts with the kind of factory integrated vertical machine of the telephone buildings.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, Carol, because I think it really did bring together some of the ways that what I'm talking about and what Gail is talking about really do intersect, even though their kind of corporate approach is very, very different amongst the groups of buildings that we presented on Monday and Wednesday. And I think one of the things that Gail's talk really raised for me was how radically different a corporate entity, AT&T, and all of the other companies associated with it, that it was a holding company for, essentially, how different their identity and role as corporations were in public life and in American life than, say, a corporation like Woolworth or any of the insurance companies that were discussed, or the newspaper companies that were discussed, and what a radically different position the telephone companies had in trying to navigate what it meant to express a corporate identity. And I think a question I would have for you, Gail, is how much in common it seems like these different companies that engage in speculative real estate development and use the image of a very tall building for their own kind of brand identity, how much similarity you see between their kind of corporate attitude because they use this technique, or how much you see that they're really coming at the idea of branded architecture differently.
Uh-oh, you've got to unmute yourself.
I'm sorry about that. I just unmuted myself. Yes, I find commonalities between Singer, Metropolitan Life, and Woolworth in the sense that they're selling a commodity to thousands, maybe millions of people. Singer is a worldwide company, even beyond Europe, China and Turkey, and just expansive. It's the first international enterprise. And so, individuals purchase sewing machines, as do industrial concerns and so on. So they have a commodity that everybody knows about. And the same thing is true of Woolworths. But I think what they're trying to do is strengthen the purchaser or the consumer, at that time we'd say, I guess, purchaser of that commodity, strengthen their connection to the company, to the commodity itself. And there's a kind of circuitry of visual dynamic of linking the commodity itself to the building, to the company. And at that time, I didn't see the word brand, but I think that is what's going on. If we, retrospectively, if we look back, it is a kind of brand identity that they want to establish as powerfully as they can with individual consumer. But I did try to point to the distinction between, say, MetLife and Woolworth, where MetLife is really targeting a specific kind of consumer, their policyholders. So there are different strategies. And that led my thinking back to your talk, Kate, because I was trying to think of, if I were trying to find something that AT&T or Bell, some kind of commonality here, I was thinking about the individual and their telephone. And I was thinking, certainly if you picked up your telephone, that is the product that particular consumer is using that relates back to the company. And I thought, wouldn't it be unusual? I don't think this happened. I don't have no knowledge of it. If they branded that telephone with a kind of icon of their headquarters, and of course, since the headquarters is not so prominent, that would never happen, or did not happen. I almost be certain. So that question came to mind, and then a completely different discovery, and this is slight shifting the conversation just a bit, but it's not unrelated. That I made via your research is just to know how firmly established Metropolitan Bell in New York is down there by Wall Street. And I'm thinking, why are they? They're just sitting there. They've got their roots embedded in the infrastructure, and of course they're right next to the stock exchange. And it made me think how important telephonic communications was for this world of trading and for the stock exchange, and that is worth the money they're spending on that very valuable real estate right next to the exchange in Lower Manhattan. Worth it to them, I'm thinking. Now, I would love to hear your view on that, but I just found that fascinating, and I continue to find fascinating the very antithesis between, I guess, the difference between these infrastructural buildings that you've written so well about, so thoroughly researched, and the kind of thing in which, yes, infrastructure counts. You've got to get the people to the observatory, whatever that might be or might mean, but it's not absolutely central.
Yeah, so I think that's a great point to raise, especially in the late 19th and early 20th century. The financial markets were really more plugged into telegraphy still, and Paula Lupkin has written about this a little bit. And the kind of paper record that's left by telegraphy, that's not left by the telephone, meant that financial firms were using both the telegraph and the telephone for different purposes. What was really the kind of core clientele for the telephone in its first couple of generations were physicians and drugstores and merchants who were trying to move goods back and forth or find a patient, city offices, newspaper offices who needed to just exchange information. And it's really by the teens and the 20s that you see the financial traders moving to the telephone. And something like the Barclay VC building, the New York Telephone Building, becoming the Verizon headquarters and being across the street from the World Trade Center, that's not an accident. Like, that proximity increases the speed of trading. And you still see that being a factor in many cases where data centers and internet infrastructure is located next to financial services centers that need speed, certainly as a kind of up. And so that's a very much, You know, the wires are cheaper if it's closer, but the speed of the call and the clarity of the call is better if you're closer too. And so that expensive real estate needed to pay for itself through the kind of clientele that wanted speed and wanted good quality calls. Yeah, it's a really important factor.
Would this be a good time then to spend, 5 minutes or 10 minutes, Kate, with the history of, well, the telegraph and with the Western Union, and then on the same site, the presence of an evolution, really, of AT&T as a corporation situated in Lower Manhattan?
Yeah, absolutely. And while we were talking, let me go share my screen here. There we go. Okay, while we were talking, I added a couple of slides really quickly, just because the corporate structure of AT&T is very confusing, and it just takes forever to get it straight. AT&T is the holding company, and underneath it are the local telephone companies across the United States, the Long Lines company that provided long distance service, Western Electric that manufactured the telephones, and then Bell Labs that did research. So AT&T is over the top. And those companies that provided local service are mapped out here. These are the companies as they existed right before the breakup of the monopoly in 1984. And I show this just to give you a sense of how AT&T as a holding company really had a lot of other companies underneath it. And that relates back to how they tried to manage this sense of monopoly and identity as something that was both one unified thing and actually composed of many, many, many smaller companies. And that I'm going to go back to the beginning and answer the question that Carol posed about AT&T's actual corporate headquarters, which didn't have any telephone infrastructure. So it was very different than the headquarters for New York Telephone or New Jersey Telephone or Mountain States Bell. AT&T's corporate headquarters was actually located on top of the site of the Western Union building that had been built by George Post in 1875, had burned in 1890. It was located right here on the corner of Day Street and Broadway. And just across Day Street is where the Metropolitan Telephone Building that I spent some time on in my lecture was located right across the street. So you can see there's this close relationship between where the telegraph offices are located and where the telephone offices are located when they're built in the late 1880s. The Western Union building, after the fire, is rebuilt in the form that you see it here. It continues to stay on the corner of Broadway and Day Street, even as the Metropolitan Telephone Company begins to expand here. And then AT&T's headquarters is actually built directly on top of the Western Union building, and the Western Union building is torn down. This isn't really an accident at all. AT&T actually purchases Western Union, so the telephone company purchases its competitor in telegraphy in 1909, 1910, tears down their building and replaces it with their own headquarters. The headquarters isn't complete right away though. This is phase one that I'm showing you here. This long, narrow building with one almost little L-shaped wing that projects outwards. That L-shaped wing right here has that peak on top with the spirit of communication figure, or the Golden Boy as he's known now. And the story of the Golden Boy is its own talk on its own. He's now on the sidewalk in downtown Dallas, which is quite a story of how he got there. Phase one, 1912 to 1916. Phase two, finished in 1922, actually, despite what it says on my slide, actually expands the building out so that it's occupying the entire block along the face of Broadway. And what's interesting about this building is if you go there today, 195 Broadway, and you're looking in the entrance and you're looking in the lobby, there are no bells anywhere. There's nothing that says AT&T. They intentionally did not advertise that there was AT&T's corporate headquarters. It's a pretty blocky building. It's dignified, but it's not particularly flamboyant, certainly compared to the Woolworth building going up really close by. And that was because AT&T at this time period actually became subject to its first major antitrust suits because it had purchased Western Union, because it was purchasing a lot of local telephone companies, and they were very conscious of not wanting to appear like a really prosperous, glamorous, public facing company. They wanted to look austere and pared back. They, you know, in 1913, there was an agreement that as a kind of short-term resolution to this antitrust lawsuit that means that AT&T has to give up Western Union. And it also has to get approval before it can buy other local telephone companies. But it continues to acquire those companies. Hopefully you're saying, well, where did Western Union go? If AT&T bought them and tore down their headquarters to build their own on top of it, Western Union actually moved a few blocks away into a building that was the headquarters for the long lines department of AT&T. And I'm showing you that building here. It was built by Mackenzie, Voorhees, and Gmelin, so the same architects who built the Metropolitan Telephone Company building. And Western Union moved in along with AT&T long lines, and they had their headquarters together in this building for about 20 years until Voorhees, Gmelin, and Walker, which is the successor firm to Cyrus Eidlitz's firm, and which includes Ralph Walker, who had designed the New York Telephone building, begins a series of studies to expand this long lines building, or the Walker-Lispenard building, in 1929. And here is that existing Walker-Lispenard building. You know, some possibilities include just building a skyscraper on the side as like two separate buildings. The one that's actually chosen wraps a new setback skyscraper all the way around this previous building, and you end up with the building that you have today on Avenue of the Americas, where you can still see this is that original Walker-Lispenard building that's been reclad, and the tower of the new long lines headquarters building based in New York, which does have telephone infrastructure in it, just like the New York Telephone Company building had. At this point, Western Union gets kicked out, and they get their own headquarters building, again, a couple of blocks away. So designed by the same architects, descendants of Cyrus Eidlitz's firm. This is Ralph Walker's firm, Voorhees, Gmelin, and Walker, with the Western Union headquarters, designed in 1928 to 1930, when AT&T and Western Union finally separate again, and that's at 60 Hudson Street. And I think this is probably my favorite of the bunch. It's a pretty spectacular building. And I very quickly just made a map of this. It's not super legible, but I just did this afternoon to put together Metropolitan Telephone Building, 195 Broadway, and the New York Telephone Company building, and then AT&T long lines and Western Union. They all originate in the same block right here, and then they gradually kind of split up into much larger buildings across the 1920s, and do begin to develop, especially in this language of the late 20s, in the New York Telephone building, the Western Union building, and the long lines building. There's certainly a unifying Art Deco brick-clad, really remarkable asymmetrical setback skyscraper that develops through the language of Voorhees, Gmelin, and Walker's designs.
Well, I'll jump in while you're doing that, Kate, because what you said reminded me of a question that was posed by Nick Adams that was sent to us. And he asked, could you talk about security issues? What issues of security were there in the telephone buildings? Was there another reason why buildings might have been comparatively anonymous? An agent of Wall Street carrying all those trades, a place where every telephone owner had to pay a bill. What was its public reputation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And certainly today, telephone buildings have a lot of security. If you try to visit a telephone building and walk around inside, it's really not possible unless you have pre-approval. Security mindedness, though, has changed a lot across the 20th century, really originating more in the 1960s than in any of these earlier buildings. When the 1920s kind of corporate urban giant buildings opened, they always had huge open houses and brought hundreds of people through the building with these scripted plans. I have, as a part of my research, a couple of these scripts for how an AT&T tour guide was supposed to take someone through the building and how they were supposed to explain the technology. They brought people into the operating room, into the engineering and traffic room, all the way up to the top to the corporate offices and back down again. And so while that wasn't something that happened every day, there was a kind of desire to show off how the telephone system worked that did lead to certainly annual tours and sometimes kind of intermediary tours in between in the big buildings, and certainly In neighborhood telephone buildings that were smaller and that were not necessarily tall buildings at all, those, they wanted people to come in and feel like this was your friendly kind of neighborhood telephone office that you could have access to. It's really not until the 60s that the buildings get much more defensive and become more locked down. And there's several reasons for that I'm finding. And this is a piece of the project that's more in process than some of the others. But the two big things that I found certainly are Cold War sensibilities about monitoring communication traffic. And during World War II and in the decades after, AT&T and Long Lines built a whole kind of secondary telephone system and network in the United States to serve government communications in the event of attacks from other nations. A lot of those telephone buildings were actually buried underground. I visited one of those outside of Atlanta that's 40 feet underground instead of above ground, and that certainly changed the sensibility of the telephone company about what they needed to do to protect the infrastructure of telecommunications. So there is that kind of Cold War, post-World War II element. The second thing that leads to more security mindedness really is by the 1960s, AT&T and all of those local telephone companies have built thousands of buildings across the country, everywhere. And if you actually try to get a list of all of them, they're still not quite sure of how many buildings they're actually built. It can be hard to tell. And especially in urban centers where there were civil rights protests, AT&T was very concerned about being the target for labor protests and civil rights protests. The 60s is the period when AT&T is sued for their labor practices, both in terms of gender and in terms of race. People have the telephone company as a target for providing poor service, for not providing enough access. And so they very much, there's a full series of memos about the urban crisis within the telephone company's own management and the way that it affects how they maintain and manage their property. And they begin to view their properties as risk, right? Real estate risk, rather than just places that are a piece of the infrastructure. So that element of security also begins to keep the public out and begins to place distance between the telephone company and the neighborhood in which the telephone buildings are located.
I have a lot of other questions, and maybe we'll circle back to those. But I already forewarned Gail and Kate that I wanted to ask a little bit about research and what archives, how you dug out the materials that allowed you to answer so quickly and fluently these other kind of other these amazing other issues, these other threads or lines that one has to pull on in order to really understand what's going on in this network. So just to ask Gail maybe to begin to play tennis a little back and forth. Gail, I'm well aware of all of the time that you spent at New York Historical Society in the Cass Gilbert papers there, but I wonder if you could talk in a general way, both for students who might not know where to start on projects such as this, and how you investigated questions in different places, and then how you formulated some of your strategies for actually writing the history.
Yes, that's an interesting question, because when I wrote the book, The Skyscraper in the City, it came out of a doctoral dissertation, and that entailed extensive archival research. And a lot of it was because nothing, there wasn't a monograph on Cass Gilbert. Very little research existed on New York skyscrapers. I'd started before Sarah Bradford Landau and Carl Condit published their book on the New York skyscraper of that era. And so I had very little to go on, and because of that, I had to bury myself in archives. So yes, Carol, you're right. The New York Historical Society was absolutely key, because what happened there, and I was very fortunate. I think if you're a historian in any discipline, I mean, the discipline is history, but on any subject, I guess I want to say, to have an archive, to have a surviving set of documents is so, it's so valuable. I mean, I wouldn't say it's necessarily essential, but it's so valuable. In this case, what I had at the New York Historical Society is what Henry Hope Reed moved from Cass Gilbert's house in Connecticut, files that had not been cataloged of his entire office to the New York Historical Society. He since rescued them in the 1960s, 1970s, right around then. And so they were there, but uncatalogued. And I chose that topic at a time when to work on a skyscraper that had a kind of historical dimension to it. In other words, it was Gothic. Was still not especially popular. When I was in grad school, the idea is that we look at the history of modernism, and this is not, that was still very much around. So this is not necessarily a modern building. And so maybe that was a blessing in disguise. Nobody had worked on it. I was the first one to do it, but I started there. But I think it's also important to say that well into the project, very late into the project, I was able to get access to the Woolworth Corporation archives. And that was also not a formal archive. It was just a closet in the Woolworth building up underneath the gabled roof on top of the block. But everything was there. Everything that Woolworth wrote, his diaries from his trips to Europe. Everything. The letters he wrote to his store managers. So to have that kind of rich archive was great for me. The disadvantage of it, and by the way, there were 5 archives where I did research for Cass Gilbert. There were another 2 where I did research for Woolworth, the Watertown Daily News, the newspaper in his hometown of Watertown, also in Lancaster, the Historical Society there. That was his first Woolworth store. So, and there was a substantial amount of material there. So I followed the archives according to the individuals involved. But what I was going to say, the drawback of that is you have so much material. I was battling with just thousands of records, thousands of documents. And so it took some time to sort that out. So the first thing I did was piece it together the best I could to tell the story of the building, to basically tell the story of the client, what he was thinking about his project, how he commissioned the architect, how the building was built, and so on. And then it was only when I revised my dissertation as a book that I was able to look at the methods of cultural history. And there were some really remarkable and interesting things going on in New York at the time about the urban culture of New York right around the turn of the century. So at that point, I connected methodologically to studies others had done, like William Taylor, Thomas Bender, several others that examined the culture of the city at that particular moment. So it was a 2-stage process. On one hand, I have the archives, I can substantiate all my research in those archives, but then there's a method of analysis, a cultural method of analysis that became very important. And if I didn't have those scholars in New York, working right around the same time I was on the cultural history of the city, it would not have been the same for me. So I benefited greatly for new scholarship coming out on the cultural environment of New York, right around. That was in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Books on Times Square and a very rich body of new scholarship. So yeah, I hope that's answered your question. I have another question for Kate. I'm going to save that until we hear from Kate about her research.
I did want to kind of insert an idea before Kate talks about the various places and perspectives on the research on the corporate history, but also the history of technology. Is one of the things that Don Friedman mentioned in his talk about New York and from an engineer's perspective, but he distinguished between an art historical and architectural history perspective on the building as an object and then pursuing that from a history of technology framework for understanding change, right? So it's not just engineers, but really from the history of technology, history of processes, or not so much inventions as environments of technology that produce these kind of catalysts or chemical reactions that happen in many places rather than a single client who selects an architect. And Kate, with corporate history, I wonder if both in describing where you went for your sources, but also how you how you distinguish yourself from business historians and how they look at the physical object as well as the network.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I appreciated hearing Gail talk about having too much. Because I find myself, I have thousands of buildings, and the real issue is trying to pick the ones that tell the story the best, which is a different problem than I think I've had in the past. But the real central archive, and I have to say thank you to Bill Coughlin at AT&T Archives in San Antonio, and Sheldon Hockheiser at the AT&T Archives in New Jersey, because AT&T's archives are corporate archives, and they are adding to it constantly. And the purpose of those archives is not to serve historians like me, but actually to serve the corporation itself, so that, you know, the research that's done by Sheldon and Bill and other staff really serves the kind of daily operations of AT&T. So providing access to someone like me to records and to materials is at their discretion and as they have time. And I really want to say thank you to them for making time for me. I think that without the corporate archive of AT&T, you can't do this project. As much as AT&T published about itself, and that is a huge source of information. So the corporate magazines that, you know, these kind of paternalistic New York Telephone magazine, the Pacific Bell had its magazine, Ohio Bell had a magazine, every single company had a monthly magazine. The annual reports give you a lot of data about how many telephones there are, how many customers there are. You know, you got to have that stuff. But without the corporate archives, the whole project becomes almost impossible in more detail. The other piece that's really necessary, because the AT&T corporate archives don't tell you much about the buildings. There are lots of good photographs in some cases, which varies very much from local telephone company to local telephone company. So there's a lot of good documentation for Illinois Bell and a lot of good documentation for Pacific Bell, but for Southern Bell, there's like nothing. And it just depended on the corporate practices of each of those operating companies. So the final book will reflect where I can get information, as well as the corporate archives of architects. And for me, the HLW archive was also incredibly helpful, because there are no corporate archives for the New York Telephone Company. They seem to have completely disappeared. And so to get any information about telephone buildings in New York, the first place that I have gone was HLW's corporate archives, where again, I had kind of unique access for quite some time, and they finally have at least begun, if not finished, the process of donating their corporate archive to an academic archive so that other people can have access to it, which is terrific. But for a long time, you know, if HLW had someone call them and ask them about something, they would say, ask Kate, right? So it's like unofficial kind of finding aids to what was there and what hadn't been found yet. And so, you know, the corporate archive versus the academic archive versus the library archive, you know, those are all really different ways of thinking about how you can and cannot get access. And working with corporate archives is very, very different. Because their discretion and their purpose is totally different than that of an academic archive. And that's something you could talk a lot more about. And I'll stop there just to kind of leave the question for people. But I think it's probably one reason why there's not as much work, certainly on telephone buildings, is just figuring out where the stuff is. In terms of corporate archives can be pretty difficult.
I just want to add that getting access to the Woolworth archive, what was left, I was able to do that through Vice President Barry Thompson. If I hadn't met Barry, it might have been impossible. He had majored in history in college, and he understood what I was trying to do. Prior to that, everybody I contacted didn't know what I was doing. It didn't necessarily care, but I'm very indebted to Barry Thompson, William Barry Thompson.
I think that also, Carol, you also asked a question about kind of methodology in general that I didn't answer. And for telephone buildings, I think the biggest challenge and why this has taken so long for me is that there is an incredible business history of AT&T, certainly of the building of the monopoly that needs to be processed. There is an incredible history of technology for the development of how you make a telephone call, how you make a switchboard, how you make an automated telephone call as opposed to a manual telephone call, how you build a digital switch, how you make long distance, right? How you make microwave dishes that support long distance. So there's this incredible history of technology and infrastructure. There's this incredible labor history that is about, you know, the telephone girls or the hello girls, and the kind of gendered and method of management of an incredibly large workforce, as well as AT&T's role in a huge number of labor lawsuits by the late 20th century.
Yeah, can I interrupt you?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I interrupt you for 1 second, because we did have a question earlier in the day about the operators and whether they were always all women, and maybe you could just talk a little bit more about that gender issue.
Yeah, so very, like in the first year or two, they tended to hire boys to be operators, and the conventional thinking on that was, number one, those were who was working in telegraph offices, and so there was a kind of familiarity, and they were also really cheap, and no one wanted to pay the operators very much. The boys were terrible operators, as the conventional wisdom goes, because they were super rude on the phone, which I can imagine to be true. My son is 17 now and would not make a good telephone operator. And so they quickly went to the next cheapest source of labor, which was women. And women were also polite on the phone. And there was a novelty, actually, for all of the business customers who were almost exclusively male to calling in and having a woman answer the phone. And there was this very quickly captured the public imagination that you were talking potentially to some wonderful, beautiful woman who would become your wife. And you can see this in the telephone company literature. They tell story after story of women who got married to someone who called them on the phone, both to kind of drum up business customers, but also to convince operators to stay on the job. Because I'll also say that being a telephone operator, I've never done it, but I've talked to people who have, and there's certainly oral histories of people who did it. And it's actually really hard work. It's just intense, unrelenting. And it was difficult to keep women on the job. And so some of the gendered spaces in the buildings were things like restrooms, sleeping porches, nursing rooms, hospital rooms, doctors' rooms, to try to help people soothe their nervous conditions, as well as just give them recreational space, so that you could take breaks from this kind of constant connection and constant talking and constant surveillance, actually, of the workforce by management.
Another theme that I think we might probe a little bit is the idea of a company which sells itself on innovation. And I think Bell Labs is always associated with a kind of vanguard of technology. And that would certainly seem to be an important point in the self-presentation of a corporation, that they're always inventing, that they're always, pushing forward the, well, as we experience today, 5G, today's New York Times cover has a wraparound front page advertising the next fastest service. And so the image of innovation is certainly not the image of the architecture or the headquarters building, or whether it was Philip Johnson or going back to downtown in Wells Bosworth. And then, of course, the issue of style is as Gail was alluding to, kind of in the generation of the 80s and 90s, and even before that, kind of paramount in the way that graduate students and universities academics were thinking about we're kind of framing the issues about what is the source of style, what is the meaning of style, is it a Eurocentric reference, is it a historical reference, is it an American voice? And that tension that I talked a little bit about last time as well was certainly an ever-present part of the discussion about what style do you choose. That's a very 19th century question. And of course, this is one that Gail has been raised very much with the Woolworth Building, Cathedral to Commerce, but maybe it wasn't so important for Woolworth's image of his company to be futuristic. But in both cases, we have a kind of retrograde association of style with two different very different companies, right? So maybe you could both talk about that a little bit.
I think for Woolworth, he traveled in Europe and he loved the Cathedral of Cologne, you know, so he leaned towards the Gothic, and then he saw Cass Gilbert's Gothic West Street building, which, you know, now today there's a recent book on skyscraper Gothic. That's an early example of the so-called skyscraper Gothic style. And so Woolworth liked that building and wanted one like it. But in addition to that, he was a great fan of Gothic architecture. And then on top of that, he chose as a model the Victoria Tower of the Houses of Parliament. So this was a kind of civic structure, a kind of government building. And he was viewing his own company as an empire. I don't know if he himself made that connection with the British Empire, but nonetheless, you know, this was very much Woolworth's own taste. So this was a time, I think, you know, early 20th century, where a client, and we could also say the same thing for John Rogers Hegeman, you know, he said that he wanted a copy of St. Mark's Campanile in Venice. That's exactly what he wanted that design to be. A little less is known about Ernest Flagg, but I do think that modern French, you know, that kind of idiom that's so popular in Paris, and you think of the fashion industry in Paris, that there's certainly got to be some connections there. So style is serving a particular purpose in all of those cases, without any question.
And I think in the case of the telephone company, by the 20s, they had built up enough of a monopoly that they were more secure in trying to express a public image. And so by the mid-20s, this idea that they were going to express an American perpendicular and make their own style. That the American perpendicular would express the kind of optimism of technology and be a way of creating a narrative around buildings. That I like the distinction you made between a big building and a tall building earlier, because I do think telephone buildings are largely big buildings and they take up a whole block, right? They have a huge volume. The New York Telephone Building had 1 million square feet, right? It's about bulkiness. And they were trying to create a narrative around breaking down these enormous buildings that for the most part, once you got outside of New York and Chicago, these were the biggest buildings in town. And they were quite different and very obvious, like you could not get away from them. And so the idea of the American perpendicular as something that was both distinctive, but still had that kind of cachet as being connected to the English Gothic and the perpendicular style.
Sure.
That kind of American uncertainty still is there. But the most important thing was that none of those buildings were the same. They were not identical in any way, shape, or form, and they really were built by local firms who were supposed to come up with what this American perpendicular was supposed to be. So a firm like Voorhees, Gmelin & Walker, it looked pretty different, right? It looked pretty forward-looking. But a firm like, I'm trying to think of a good one that's a little bit more historicizing. I think Hewitt and Brown, maybe it's a little bit more historicizing. There's one in Portland, Maine that's still a little bit on the edge of being a little bit more like the Woolworth building. You know, some of them hedged their bets a little bit, and that was because it was the local firms who were really interpreting what American perpendicular meant in the context of those regional headquarters buildings that incorporated infrastructure, but were also functioning as a corporate headquarters.
Well, we're coming very close to the top of our hour, and I'll invite, Gail, if you have some additional comments you want to make.
Yes, I have one quick comment, and that's that I've been thinking all along about the distinction between these early telephone buildings in the building in Lower Manhattan, circa 1900, and then what we see happening with Singer and Woolworth and MetLife, and why, in a sense, it's hiding this identity. But that's not really what is happening. The more thought I give to it, I'm thinking that this is very much like a utility, like an electrical utility or something else. People are dependent on the telephone. It's not like you have a choice of a commodity to purchase. I think with Singer and with Woolworth and even with MetLife, a consumer, somebody who's purchasing this thing that this company is making, does have a choice. I guess Singer pretty much dominates the market, but nonetheless, they can pick and choose. I think with the telephone, you've got to have that telephone service. If you're a business, you know, you've got to have that. You don't have a choice. I mean, and so maybe Bell, AT&T, you know, they know that they are in fact a utility, and so they have a different objective in relating to their customers. And it's you know, and by the 20s, it's pretty clear. You know, you're not flashy or, you know, whatever. You have a certain monumental image that projects a favorable image, but you're not trying to catch their attention or catch their interest or build their loyalty and so on, because they really need you. If I've got that right.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's a little complicated because the telephone companies had to essentially navigate these incredibly complex local systems. So every telephone franchise was negotiated locally with a local municipality. And so there is no national telephone system, actually. I mean, there is physically, but in terms of, you know, when the New York Telephone is negotiating with the government of New York State, or negotiating with the city of New York, they're negotiating one by one with every community that they're located in. It's incredibly complicated and cumbersome. And, you know, I think someone brought up 5G earlier, and as we see 5G being extended across the country, you know, here in North Texas, there are very different ways that utility has been regulated versus someplace else. And this intensely local story that's associated with telephone buildings and these local franchises is incredibly important. And there was huge competition. Every license that they tried to negotiate, every franchise they tried to negotiate, there were competitors everywhere. As much as they were fiercely competitive and used every technique in the book to stomp out that competition so that they could build the monopoly. And part of it was patronage of local firms. If you start looking at which firms got buildings, it's like the mayor's brother or his cousin, right? They're like kind of using the techniques of engaging local businesses in order to build up goodwill so that they're the good company, right? They're that neighbor that you want in your town versus some other startup telephone company. They're pretty good at it.
It's a different playing field. It's a different kind of competition.
Yeah.
You're not trying to get the guy on the street who's going to buy the dazzling commodity in the window. It's a different thing.
Yeah, it's the mayor.
Well, this has been really an incredibly fascinating couple of sessions and two terrific talks that have given so many dimensions to add to this discussion of the skyscraper history. We've now finished 6 lectures by, I think, 5 people. And we had an add-on by Richard Haw about the Brooklyn Bridge that I invite those who came to first to the series through the list of just the specific semester to go back and dip into the 19th century and both the technology and design issues, as well as the kind of the heroic inventor in the case of John Roebling with Richard Haw's talk. I want to mention our next meeting in the week 4 of this series, which is going to feature the 2 Andrews, A.J. Sandoval Strauss, who has written a wonderful book on the hotel, on the American Hotel, and of course, New York's own specialist, Mr. New York Andrew Dolkart, who will, in one of the many directions that he's pursued New York architecture and especially high-rises, is going to talk about loft buildings and the skyscraper factory that is the loft. So hotels and lofts are framed under the topic for October 28th, Wednesday, October 28th. I think there's a debate that night as well, but it's later in the night. Are going to explore the typology of the commercial building, be it a residential or tourist hotel or a loft space for rent, that typology that is space for rent, the commodity of space. So in that session, which is called the tall, not office building, we're going to look a little bit more at this subject of typology that I hoped that we would be getting into, and we have in the case of especially the telephone building, and that we will continue to pursue in the week 4 session. And I'll say sessions because I think that I'm going to have to take over one of those points of discussion in order to insert my 2 cents about the typology of the commercial urban building. So I think we have had an incredibly rich investigation, and we've even touched on the issue of style, which is the one that so predominated, certainly the textbooks that I read when I was in graduate school. So rewriting skyscraper history, I think, has is now almost encyclopedic rather than a series of chapters. And we'll try to, in the spirit of your describing your respective researches, we're going to try to winnow that down a little bit too in order to the idea. So thank you so much, Gail and Kate, for 2 really great talks, and we'll see everybody. Oh, and I have to mention, there's an additional lecture next week. It doesn't fit in chronologically into our series, but Larry Samuels has written a book on Tudor City. And those, of course, are skyscraper residences in New York in a kind of neo-Gothic or Tudor, obviously Tudor style. And we will insert that in between the alternating weeks of our semester. So I'm hoping to see everybody next week, not next week, but on the 26th. It's actually alternating weeks, but it's on Monday on Tudor City, and then on Wednesday with the 2 Andrews talking about hotels and lofts. So I hope to see everybody then. And again, thank you so much. And
thank you, Carol.
Upward.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Gail.
Bye.
Thank you, Kate.